It's been a busy few days in politics, including, of course, tonight's top story, the public impeachment hearings taking place in Washington. Joining me now for some analysis is our Wednesday panel. Christina Greer is a NY1 political commentator and a political science professor at Fordham University. She is also a co-host of the podcast FAQ NYC. I'm also joined by my colleagues Juan Manuel Benitez and Zach Fink. Good evening, all. And what did you make of the impact today's hearing will have? Where does it fit into the larger narrative?
Please. Well, I think it's interesting that the president, of course, says, I didn't watch it. It was purely theater, even though if you look at his timeline, he was clearly retweeting other people who were watching it. So the Republican talking points have come out. This is theater. It's all false. We don't need to really pay attention. We don't know who this whistleblower is. This is now third hand. So their talking points are clearly succinct, but that doesn't negate the fact that we will have more testimony on Friday. It doesn't negate the fact that, individuals are seasoned sort of citizens of the United States who are military personnel who have served our nation in a host of ways are coming forward and saying there are kind of two tracks of diplomacy going on. And this second track not only made me feel uncomfortable, but it does seem as though it's teetering on possibly illegal or whatever it may be. Mm-hmm. And it's at least worth me putting myself on the line, putting my career on the line, putting my family possibly in danger to say something for the sake of the American people. I think that's an important conversation. It's a sad day in a lot of ways. I know a lot of Democrats are celebrating. We're finally getting this ball rolling on the Ukraine and possible impeachment. But if we think about the gravitas of possibly having an executive who has tried to partner with a foreign entity against another United States citizen, it's actually a pretty sad day for American democracy.
But there's a little bit of theater as well. I think that we saw Congress people trying to establish two different narratives, the Democratic narrative and the Republican narrative, and using those witnesses as the characters of the play before the American people. Many of them, they don't even know what's going on, and they don't know what this is about. And this is about possible abuse of power. And this is about the Democrats trying to write the articles of impeachment and maybe impeaching the president in the House and then going to a trial in the Senate that is not going anywhere. So it is theater for the public to see, because the impact is not going to be whether they're going to be able to take the president out of the White House through this process. It's going to be more to the voters, this is what the president did or did not do, and then you decide in the election next November.
Right. I mean, the norm has been shattered, right? Regardless of the outcome of this, right? The only question is what will now happen if a future president does something like this, does the kind of thing of which the president is being accused, right?
Well, I mean, I think this is a larger question, not just about 2020, but about the future of our democracy. And we know for the Republicans, they're performing for a theater of one. They are only performing for the president because they know
also
that...
for the Republican voters.
For the Republican voters, but
90% of them, 95% of them are supporting this president.
Yeah, but for the most part, when we see Republican members of the House and Senate doing press conferences, they know that the president is watching them, and they don't want to be in his crosshairs because he's made it very clear, if you are not with me, then I will make sure I primary you. And sort of, we've seen the way he talks about people in his own party. So I think that it's a concern not just about how we're going to frame 2020, the president who possibly might be impeached or not, versus the Democratic candidate, but also what does the future of this nation look like if we have a president? This is exactly what George Washington warned us about in his farewell address, hyperpartisanship, but also foreign interference.
Foreign entanglements, that's right. And Zach, I mean, we saw in the background, you see, like, during the breaks and in the spin zone, you'd see Lee Zeldin and other people who were not members of the committee would show up to try and get in front of the cameras, right? Going back to this question of who is the audience here and what are these people trying to do? That doesn't necessarily, though, tell the whole story, does it?
And certainly we're behind them nodding, if not actually grabbing the microphones themselves. I mean, looking at this from 25,000 feet, how is it going to actually affect the election? Because to Juan's point, I think it's unlikely you'd have the votes to actually remove Donald Trump from office. I think it does wind up helping the president with his base. I mean, if history is any guide, the most recent history with the Clinton impeachment, the nation kind of rallied around Clinton. They thought the Republicans had overreached. I also understand the Democratic perspective, which is, listen, this is not about politics. We have a constitutional obligation to follow through and see where the facts may go. However, politically, I think it's going to wind up harming them in 2020.
And you talked about breaking the rules. I think Americans already, Republicans or Democrats, they already know that this president from day one is been breaking traditional rules and conventions. And as long as the economy is doing well, as long as things are going okay around me, I think I'm going to be fine. We spoke about it last night. He gave a speech at the Economic Club of New York yesterday, and he talked about the economy. He talked about jobs and trade and how the U.S. has regained the power, or at least in the international sphere. That's what voters are going to look at next year, not so much as the president, this current president, is breaking all norms and is making us feel uncomfortable about our democracy. I think voters are going to be more pragmatic than that.
Well, he's certainly forcing the question. If you take as a metaphor for the entire presidency, I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose support. Okay, well, there he is, smoking gun. Somebody's laying there in the middle of Fifth Avenue. It's called, foreign relations in Ukraine. What are we going to do about it? Let's switch topics and talk a little bit about former Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who seems to be, as far as I can tell, he's plugging along. He showed up in Arkansas himself, showed up in Little Rock to file the papers in person to enable him to possibly run. We're getting some word that there's another deadline coming up at the end of the week. He may be on track to show up in the New Hampshire primary as well.
Yeah, Juan and I were talking about this. I just don't think that what the Democratic Party needs is a quasi-Republican billionaire from New York City to jump into this race and muddy the waters. I do think that we have plenty of candidates, albeit none of them are perfect, but this is what a primary period is for, to actually make weaker candidates stronger, make them we saw this with Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton. Neither one of them were ideal in 2007 and even the beginning of 2008, but going back and forth, they evolved into really strong candidates. I think we have the makings of, a Michelangelo's David, if you will, of the candidates we have. I don't think that Michael Bloomberg entering into the race with some of his highly problematic policies, I would argue, during his time as mayor, is really what I would say the core base of the Democratic Party wants or needs right now. And also, if we think about one of the core bases of the Democratic Party, it's black women. And that early polling has said that no one is interested in a Michael Bloomberg presidency just yet.
On the other hand, playing devil's advocate, if you see the calendar next year, everything is so unpredictable. When you think about possibly having a Senate trial of impeachment, in January, February, March, in the middle of the initial caucus states and primary states, and having some of those Democratic candidates for president being part of that Senate trial, because they are United States senators, I think makes everything so unpredictable that anybody at any point, even one with a lot of money to spend, can just jump in and try to see if there's an impact in the race.
Yeah, he clearly thinks something can change, right, Zach? And we know from past experience, right? Richard Nixon wins a smashing victory in 1972. 2 years later, he has to resign in disgrace. George H.W. Bush wins the Iraq War or fights the Iraq War, has sky-high percentages, including in the year that he lost to Bill Clinton in 1992.
Well, it certainly shakes up the race. Already we're now hearing Deval Patrick, the former Massachusetts governor, is talking very seriously about getting in. A lot of people who are kind of on the sidelines are saying, well, hang on a minute. If this guy can jump in this late, maybe I can jump in this late. Even Hillary Clinton apparently the other day left the door a little more ajar than people thought she would about possibly jumping in 2020. It does seem as though there's an argument to be made that when Elizabeth Warren started to emerge here and she was really going to take on the moneyed class in this country, there was a panic among the rich and the billionaire set. Oh my God, we can't actually have this. It's one thing to talk that rhetoric on the campaign trail. It's another thing to actually be the nominee and have the threat of getting in there and really taxing Wall Street at the rates the Democrats have been talking about.
Like Chris